The final verdict was made today on a power abuse case that led to South Korea's first impeachment in history. The ruling comes 3 years after the corruption scandal of former President Park Geun-hye and her close confidant Choi Soon-sil first emerged. The Supreme Court dismissed appeals court rulings for all three, Park Geun-hye, Choi Soon-sil, as well as Samsung heir apparent Lee Jae-yong, sending back the cases to the Seoul High Court. The three now face retrials, but it's widely believed that both Park and Lee will face heavier sentences, as the top court today ruled a larger sum of Lee's donations constitute bribes for his political gains. Before we go in-depth on the issue with an expert, let's turn to our Choi Soon-sil for more on today's ruling.
The Supreme Court has found Samsung Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong guilty of 2 counts of bribery for the 3 horses and $1.3 million he gave to former President Park Geun-hye's confidant Choi Soon-sil. He will sit for a retrial at the appeals court. The Supreme Court also asked the appeals court to review Park's prison sentence again because she was given a combined sentence for bribery and corruption, while the law requires separate sentences for public officials convicted of bribe-taking. That means Park will likely get another prison sentence at the appeals court. For Park's confidant Choi Soon-sil, the court says the charge that she extorted money from local companies is not clearly proven, and it asked the lower court to review those charges again. At retrial, she's likely to get her prison sentence reduced. While all of those involved in the corruption scandal will go through a retrial at the appeals courts, all eyes are on Lee Jae-yong, as he is likely to face a prison sentence this time. And watchers speculate this may push South Korea's largest tech giant into an extended period of difficulties amid the simmering trade tensions between South Korea and Japan. Choi Soon-sil, Arirang News.
For further discussion on today's final verdict, Dr. Keechang, professor of law at Korea University Law School, now joins me in the studio. Welcome to the program.
Hi.
The Supreme Court dismissed lower court rulings on the bribery cases of former President Park Geun-hye, Choi Soon-sil, as well as Lee Jae-yong. What does this mean?
First of all, viewers need to know that under Korean criminal procedure, it is not only the defendant who can appeal, but prosecution can also appeal. So in the present case, both prosecution as well as the defendants appealed. Now the Supreme Court overturned the lower court's decision. That usually means that in a country where only the defendant can appeal, if the higher court overturns, it's a good news for the defendant. But here, it was the prosecution mostly who prevailed in this Supreme Court's decision. So the lower court, some of the alleged facts, lower court held that they did not constitute bribe, but today Supreme Court ruled that lower court committed an error of law. Lower court should have found them to be bribe, something like that.
Now, the key point was whether the 3 horses donated by Lee Jae-yong to Choi Soon-sil's daughter for her equestrian training should be seen as bribes for his political gains. And today, the Supreme Court ruled that the 3 horses worth some 3.4 billion won constitute bribes, which is a huge blow to Lee Jae-yong. And the top court also ruled that Lee's donation worth some 1.6 billion won given to the Korea Winter Sports Elite Center, a controversial sports center that was established by Choi Soon-sil, also should be seen as bribes. Now, this increases the sum of Lee Jae-yong's bribes by 5 billion won from the lower court's ruling. What's next for Lee Jae-yong?
Not a very good news for Mr. Lee. The facts might be pretty simple for layman's point of view. Basically, Mr. Lee offered 3 horses. Mr. Lee gave quite a bit of money to a sports foundation, which was run by Choi Soon-sil. Did they count a bribe? The legal view, it was very complicated. The first instance court found that they constituted bribe. Appellate court found that they are not bribe. But today, Supreme Court finally held that they do constitute bribe. Therefore, Mr. Lee's criminal offense would most probably be ruled to be a little bit more serious than the appellate court held. So it may be that there is some likelihood that Mr. Lee might have to face imprisonment sentence when the appellate court tries again. But we will have to wait and see.
Now, another key point was whether Lee Jae-yong had asked former President Park Geun-hye a political favor in return for his donations. And the Supreme Court today said yes, because issues related to Lee Jae-yong's leadership succession clearly existed at Samsung at the time he made those donations. So those donations are indeed bribes. How do you see this?
Yes, that's actually closely connected to the money offered to the sports foundation. Appellate court found that they did not amount to bribe because appellate court decided that there was no pending issue at that time. So money was given, but there was no pending issue, so we can't find it as bribe. Now, today, Supreme Court held that, yes, there was a pending issue, and the money was to promote that particular pending issue, which was the succession issue. So this ruling of today will put Mr. Lee and the Samsung Group in a little bit more difficult situation. Now there is this other pending investigation and trial relating to accounting rule violation, and that's also very closely connected to today's ruling. It's not a very good news for Mr. Lee.
Now, speaking of which, as you've mentioned, another headache for Samsung is the investigation that are ongoing on Samsung Biologics Company on its suspected violation of accounting rules. Do you think today's ruling would have an impact on the investigation on Samsung Biologics?
I would say so. Basically, that alleged crime has been investigated by Mr. Yoon, who is now the head of prosecution. Yoon Sung-yeol was responsible for the initial investigation. And I'm sure today's ruling must have been warmly welcomed by Mr. Yoon, because Supreme Court affirmed that Samsung at that time was keen to ensure the smooth succession of Lee Jae-yong, Lee Jae-yong's takeover of Samsung Group. And in order to kind of soften the way, they allegedly fiddled the accounting aspects, financial aspect of Samsung Biologics to facilitate the leadership succession. And in the course of that, Samsung Biologics violated accounting rules. That's the alleged crime. And today's ruling clearly is in favor of prosecution's position.
Well, a lot of uncertainties lie ahead for Korea's biggest conglomerate. Now, let's break down the prison terms. The appeals court ruled that Park Geun-hye should face 25 years in prison with a fine of 20 billion won, and for Lee Jae-yong, 2.5 years with a probation of 4 years, and Choi Soon-sil, 20 years with a fine of 20 billion won. Now, you've mentioned that today's ruling is definitely not a good news for Lee Jae-yong, but how many years behind bars do you expect for him, as well as Park Geun-hye and Choi Soon-sil?
Well, I suppose no one can really predict what the appellate court will rule. Quite often it can be another division within the appellate court who may deal with this case when now that it's sent back. But with regard to former President Park, one can expect that she might have to face overall somewhat longer sentence, because today's ruling was that it was wrong, it was an error of law for the appellate court to give a combined sentence for President Park. Basically, Supreme Court held that there must have been two separate sentences which must be served consecutively. So that will not be a very good news for Mrs. Park. But in the case of Choi Soon-sil, today's ruling is somewhat good news for Choi Soon-sil because Supreme Court found that some of the extortion charge was not found to be substantiated. So Choi Soon-sil was cleared of some of the extortion charge. So she might expect to have a slightly better sentence. In the case of Lee Jae-yong, I think he will clearly have to face a somewhat more tougher situation. But whether he will again receive suspended sentence, if the ultimate sentence is 3 years or less, then the court can suspend the prison sentence so that Lee Jae-yong does not have to come back to prison. So whether Lee Jae-yong can get 3 years or less or longer than 3 years, we will have to wait and see.
Now, today's ruling was made by all 12 Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Kim Myeong-su. Are there any minor opinions that are worth taking note of?
The minority opinion, yes. Actually, today's ruling came with quite a lot of minority or concurring opinions. Some dissenting opinion as well, but most of them are largely technical issue, legal. It would only interest lawyers. For instance, offering a horse, whether the price itself constitutes bribe or whether the benefit of using the horse constitutes bribe. Or other issue, legal issue, for instance, offering a horse to Jung Yura, Choi Soon-sil's daughter. Is it bribe to the official or is it bribe to a third party in order to influence the official? That kind of technical legal issues. There were several concurring opinions, but a notable dissenting opinion was issued today by 3 justices about Choi Soon-sil's extortion charge. Choi Soon-sil, by the majority of the court, was cleared of the extortion. Choi Soon-sil urged many businessmen to give contract to some of her companies. But the minority opinion held that that amounted to extortion enough. If a person of that power and that stature urges, then that should count as extortion. So that's today's minority opinion.
Now, as a legal professional, I'm sure you've kept close tabs on the developments surrounding this whole corruption scandal that led to the impeachment of President Park Geun-hye. What do you think is the message that these cases, as well as the rulings, send to the people of Korea?
First of all, it's not a happy situation, from any count. It's not a happy situation where the head of state is impeached, dragged out, and then was prosecuted and serving a jail sentence. It's not a good news. But the silver lining, if there is a silver lining to this overall unhappy situation, is that we have reached a very mature democracy where impeachment did take place in a very orderly manner, and then the justice system works, and then court finally rules about the criminal offenses of former president and the biggest industrialist of the country, one of the biggest head of the industry, Samsung head. All these powerful people, they are also equally subject to law and rule of law. That is, I think, is somewhat encouraging aspect of today's ruling. But I hope that this whole unfortunate events will soon be settled, and then some kind of political arrangement can be made so that we can all move on and move towards brighter future.
Well, the people of Korea showed mixed reactions today to the court's ruling, but let's see how things unfold from this point on. Thank you so much, Professor Kim, for your insights.
Thank you.
And that wraps up our show. Thank you, as always, for being with us.